grade, we are going to continue with our storytelling project. So a couple weeks ago, we started to talk about storytelling, and we really focused on the Ojibwe tribe of Native Americans and their tradition of telling stories and passing them down from generation to generation. A lot of these stories are almost like myths or legends, and we focused on one called Why the Porcupine Has Quills. And we noticed that a lot of times these myths and legends, these stories, are kind of explaining why things in nature are the way that they are. So a lot of you started to write your own stories, explaining why things are the way that they are. Some examples I think people were working on, like why a unicorn has a horn, why there are rainbows, why there are sunrises and sunsets, things like that. So we're focusing more on nature. So start out with that. Start out with a story. These can be really imaginative. Again, they're more myths and legends, which means that they could be real, it could be a true story, but we don't really know for sure. A lot of times there's some magical powers happening in these stories, and a lot of maybe talking animals, talking trees, things like that. Those things from nature kind of come alive. So you can have a lot of fun writing these stories. So start with the story. Next comes the weaving. So we are going to be making a weaving on a paper plate, but it's all going to be representative of your story that you have written. So your weaving should look like it's a scene that came right out of your story. So be thinking about that when you're writing. I'm going to show you an example of a story that I've written and a weaving that I'm going to make that goes along with my story. So follow along with that. I can't wait to see what you create. These are going to be super fun, so let's get started. How rivers came to be. Long, long ago lived a clan of wild cats. Now these weren't your average house cats. These cats were taller than the mountains and had tails that seemed never ending. They lived among treetops and could touch the clouds. Every once in a while, these wild cats would come down to the land and draw pictures in the dirt with their tails. They had no formal artistic training, so they drew very organic, abstract, swirly, tangled lines. Their drawings left an impression in the dirt, and when it rained, these indents in the earth became filled with water and are what we now know as rivers. And that is how rivers came to be. The end. So my plate is now dry, and I'm ready to start cutting the notches around the edges of my plate so that when I string my loom, the string will stay in place. So you're going to cut 10 across the top and 2 across the bottom. Depending on your design, if you are making your weaving, if you're making it a tree, if you want that shape and you want the bottom part to be smaller and the top to be larger, you want to make sure that your background aligns with that. If you need to turn it over for whatever you're making, say I was actually going to make mine a tent or something else, and it needed to be smaller at the top of my scene and larger at the bottom, I would cut out my 10 notches here and my 2 notches here. But I am making a tree for my weaving just because it goes along with my story so well. So I'm going to cut out 2 notches on the bottom in the middle as best as I can, and then 10 across the top. Okay, so I have my notches all cut out. Now it is time to string my loom. So again, since I'm making a tree, I'm going to string my loom using brown yarn for my tree trunk and my branches, but you can use whatever yarn you want to that makes sense with the scene from your story. So I already cut out just a really long piece of yarn. It was about the length of like my arm span. Both of my arms stretched out. I did 3 of those, and then I cut that long piece of yarn. If you need to add to it, you can always tie on a new piece, but just make sure you start out with a really long piece. So you're going to start at the top on the first notch that you cut, and you're going to flip it over because you want the end of your yarn to stick out of the back. You can tie it off later, but you're going to stick it in that first notch, and then you're going to come down to the bottom and attach it to the notch on the same side at the bottom. Then you're going to come from the back up to the top, go into the next notch, and come back down into that same notch. So remember, we only have 2 notches at the bottom. So these first 5 notches at the top, you're going to string and connect them all to this notch on the left side. The notches on the rest of the 5 notches on the right side, you're going to connect down to the notch at the bottom on the right. Here we go. After you connect the last notch from the top to the bottom, your yarn should be sticking out the back. What you're going to do, so I ended off over here, I'm going to guide this up into the next one so that I'm back on the front side. And I'm going to take the rest of this string. If you're almost out of string at this point, add some more because you will need it to wrap the tree trunk or the top to make it these 2 pieces joined together. I'm going to take this and I'm going to kind of crumple it up so it's not so long. And I'm going to wrap underneath all the strings on my loom, and I'm going to pull it together. And I'm going to keep going over and under and wrapping it around. And I'm going to see my tree trunk start to take shape. The higher I go, the more of the background I'm going to see because it's going to pull all of those strings together. Now I don't want to go too high because I want to have some space to still weave the rest of my tree, but I would say that's about good. I can see my river here, my grass, I can see part of my mountain, and it looks like I have a pretty good sized tree trunk. So I'm going to take this rest of my brown yarn, I'm going to cut it a little bit shorter and add on a new piece so that I can start weaving my color into my trees. So I've tied on my new piece, and I want to point out that end on the back where we started, if you want, it should stay connected in that little notch, but just to make it a little more secure so it doesn't fall out, tie it to this string that's closest to it, and then it won't fall out. Okay, I am ready to start weaving now. So I've attached a dark green piece of yarn, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to weave over and under all of these strings. So I'm going to start by going right, and then I'm going to turn my yarn around and weave the other direction, the opposite way, over and under, the opposite of what I just did in the row before. And I'm going to keep going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth until I get as tall as I want my tree. If I need to attach new yarn at any point, I can do that. You can attach different colors. You can attach different textures of yarn. It's all up to you. But here we go with the weaving. It's easier for me to crumple up my yarn and take it over and under all of them as I go that way, instead of just taking it from the end of the string and doing it. So whatever's easiest for you. When you get to the end of the row, kind of push your yarn down so that it's all tight and ready for the next row. I also want to point out a trick. You can, before you weave a row, what you can do is kind of figure out which pieces of string you're going to have to go under. Pick those all up with one finger, and that creates this opening. It's going to be really hard to tell in here, but it's going to create an opening where you can then just crumple up all your yarn and just take it through the entire row, and it will just pull your yarn. It'll just kind of weave it all at once. So there I have my tree. My end of my yarn, I just made sure to weave into the middle, and all I did was I tucked the rest of it behind the weaving because you're not going to see that part. In my last step, I'm going to actually paint some of the cats from my story. I just wanted to make sure that the weaving wouldn't cover them up, so I'm going to quick paint those on there and be careful of the yarn, and then I will be all finished.